So we are just about done with our quilt. What's left is to turn it into a quilt top. So if you remember back to our video tutorial on how to read a pattern, you remember that when you got to the layout diagram, they're always going to assume that you know what you're doing. So this video shows you what you're doing. Some quilts are, most quilts actually, are sewn together in horizontal rows, and then you sew your rows together to create your quilt top. Some of them will be on the diagonal. That's called sewing together on point. But for a beginner and until you get the hang of it, I would stick to ones that are sewn together horizontally. It's a little bit easier to wrap your brain around. So if you remember, when we were pressing 2 videos ago, we pressed half our blocks so that the seam went under the top row and half of them so the seam went under the bottom row. What that does is, just like when we were pressing seams in opposite directions when we put our blocks together to create a nesting seam, you're also going to have a nesting seam right here. Now, I've got really busy fabrics. This is Tango from QT Fabrics. Really love it. This quilt's going to go to my daughter when this video tutorial series is done, and she's going to love this. She is almost 4. And so you're really not going to see if I'm off on this seam, but that's not the case with every fabric. So you want to make sure that you're practicing, even if you do have kind of a busier background like I do, to try to get those good joins, because then you will have it done when it matters. And so I'm going to show you how to sew that together now. So when you saw those first rows, it normally is like 4 blocks. In this quilt, it was 4 blocks separate. And then in the second row in that assembly diagram, it had 2 sewn together. So that's telling you you have 4 blocks in a row, and you're supposed to sew them into sets of 2. They're called twosies a lot. So that's what we're going to make right now, is twosies. So what I'm going to do is, I've got it laid out exactly the way it needs to be, because then I'm less likely to screw something up and have to rip out a seam. I'm going to flip this over so that my right sides are together. And then, just like when we were getting our seams to nest, when we were doing this for putting the blocks together, when we sew this into rows, we're going to do the same thing. So I'm getting this seam to nest, and I've got one seam going to the right and the other seam going to the left. So those are right nice and snug with each other. And I'm going to put that pin in the left side of the seam allowance, going over where the 1/4 inch seam is going to be sewn. Doesn't really do you much good to pin way out here, because this is where it's going to matter to have that good join. So you want to pin where it matters and where you're going to be sewing over. Now, especially when you're getting started, sometimes maybe you got a little bit better at your 1/4 inch seam as you were going along, or you sewed some blocks on one day and you're having a great day, and you sewed some blocks on another day and it wasn't such a great day. So maybe your blocks aren't the same size. So I'm going to show you how to ease that in, so that way you don't have to worry about squaring up your blocks, because that can be a pain, and this is a large block, so you can't just get like a 12.5 inch ruler and go for it. It would be challenging. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to get my corners lined up, and I'm going to pin there. And then I'm going to turn this block on the side. So what I'm doing is I'm kind of pulling this taut. I'm not stretching it. That would be bad. That would stretch it out of place and it would get warped and it wouldn't lie flat when you're all done. But I'm just pulling it nice and taut. And then I kind of like walk my fingers into the center. So that way I know I've got the exact center, or close enough anyway, of the top and bottom blocks. So that way if there's any easing to do, I can do it in between these 2 pins and then in between these 2 pins. And that way you don't end up with like a big bunch and a pleat like right where a pin is supposed to be. So I'm going to repeat that now on the other side. First, get it in the corner, and then kind of walk my fingers in to find my center, line up my edges, put my pin in. All right, so we've got 1 block pinned and ready to go, and just like you learned in chain piecing, it's a lot faster if you can do all this together. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pin all these to get them ready to sew into twosies. So I'm going to go from 16 individual blocks to 8 sets of 2. So get all that pinned, and then we're going to put it through the sewing machine. So I've got everything pinned and ready to go, and sewing these together is basically the exact same process of sewing your blocks together, just it's a little bigger, and it's going to keep getting bigger. So you can absolutely do this. You've gotten this far. This is going to be cake going forward. All right, so I'm going to grab my first block here that I've got pinned together to sew into a set of 2. And I'm getting everything lined up underneath the sewing machine. Remove that pin because we just need it to keep those corners together. I start sewing. And this is where I talk about if you need to ease in, this is where you're gonna do it. Like half of quilting is knowing where to fudge it when it isn't perfect. And your first quilt is not gonna be perfect, and that's okay. So what I'm gonna do here is I'm just gonna put my finger on the next pin, which you can kind of see down here. And I'm just kind of giving it a little bit of tension, just to keep both pieces of fabric nice and flat, both that top and bottom block. Then when that is reached, do the same thing. And I've got my hand back here, back in the back of the machine. I'm not pulling that fabric through, I'm just kind of guiding it, because as you get more and more fabric, it gets heavier and it wants to kind of hang off to the side here. So having a big nice space to work with is nice. Your kitchen or dining room table are perfectly fine, but you want to try and keep as much of the weight of the fabric on as possible, and it sometimes helps to put your hand back here and just kind of guide the fabric through as you're sewing. So to speed up the process, we're going to chain piece all of these. So I'm not going to show you every one, because if you want to learn how to chain piece, make sure you go back and watch the video on it. But we will show you how to get it started. So again, you're just going to lift up your presser foot, slide the next one under, and start sewing. So I've sewn all of my twosies together, but I'm not going to press them yet, and that's because I'm going to wait until they're together in a complete row. So the next thing that you usually see in a layout diagram, in ours you saw 4 apart, then you saw them in sets of 2, and then usually you see one entire row together, or if there's only 4 rows in the block, maybe you'll see 2 rows completely sewn together already. So that's what you're supposed to do next, is sew these together to complete the row. Now, we're still going to have those nesting seams because we're sewed every other one. So if I unfold these and I flip them over right sides together, now I have, it's too big to be on camera. It's getting big at this point, but you guys can handle it. So I've got my 2 blocks on top, and I also have my 2 blocks below. These seams over here, I'm going to nest. So they're going in opposite directions. This is the short side where we're going to join it. So I'm getting those edges lined up, and then I've got 1 seam going to the right, 1 seam going to the left, because those seams are nesting really neatly. And then this process is the exact same as we've been doing. The only difference is our block keeps getting a little bit wider as we go. So I'm going to go ahead and pin all of these together to get my 4 rows ready to sew together, and you should do the same. All right, so I've got my twosies pinned together to create the row of 1 block tall and 4 blocks wide. It's getting bigger, and this will be twice the width once I sew it together and pin it apart, or once I sew it together and press it. Same deal as always. At this point, it becomes really critical to try to keep as much of the weight of the quilt and rows on your table as possible, so it's just not pulling down as you sew. But everything else is still the same. We're using all the same basic techniques that we use going through to make the block. Where we're just, if we need to do any easing in, just go ahead and do it as you go. But really at this point, the only difference between this and sewing the center of our blocks together is that they're longer. All right, so I've got 1 row done. I'm gonna repeat with the next 3, and it just keeps going faster and faster because you have fewer pieces to sew together at this point. So we've been working really hard all along to make sure that all of our seams are pressed in opposite directions to make sure they nest and we can get really great joins that are nice and flat and very easily. And that doesn't stop now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to press my even rows to the right and my odd rows to the left. Now, it doesn't matter if you reverse that. What matters is that every other row, the seams that we just sewed together are pressed in opposite directions. And it's easier if you do an entire row going one way and the next row going the other. If you need to just do one at a time and pin those together so that way you know for sure that they're going the right way, that works. But it works for me to just do even to the right, odd to the left. All right, so I've got all my rows pressed and ready to go, and now it's time to pin these together. It's no different than when we were doing the little ones, just it's longer. And so I'll show you how to do that here. Now, when you're laying these out, it can be helpful to do it on an empty bed or floor, put all the critters out so they don't get all over it. But basically, you want to make sure that the same parts of the blocks are in the same space. So, like, for example, the blue butterfly is in the bottom corner of my block and the pink butterfly is in the top corner, so I'm going to make sure that's in the same spot as I look across the quilt to make sure everything is where it should be. If it isn't, you have two choices. You can tear some stuff out, flip it around and sew it back together, or if it's not going to bother you, you can leave it, and that's okay too. Now, if you followed all the instructions, all your seams are going to nest perfectly, just like when we were sewing our little blocks together, which makes for a really flat, really perfect join. So I'm going to show you how I pin this whole row together. So once I've made sure that I've got everything in the spaces that I need, like for example, I can see that I've got my pink butterfly in the top on this row, and then also on that row. I can flip these guys right sides together. And this first seam is going to nest really nicely. That's the one that's in the center of the block. So we've sewn that together a lot of times before. Now I'm going to also sew together, or pin together this corner. And remember, we're going to be pinning where we're going to sew. So we want to pin over where that 1/4 inch seam allowance is. So now I'm just going to give this a little bit, just make sure it's nice and taut there so that I can get to the center and put my pin in. Now for the second one, this is where the blocks come together. And again, I've got my seams going in opposite directions because I pressed them in opposite directions. So I can go ahead and put a pin in here. And that'll make sure that my blocks join perfectly as well. So I'm just going to keep working my way down. The next seam that I have that nests is going to be in the middle again. And as you're doing this, make sure you're really paying a lot of attention to make sure that your edges are nice and even with each other. If they're not, then you're going to get a seam that's too skinny, and it can pop open when you have regular wear and tear on it. Or if you send it off to be long arm quilted, it can get messed up then too. Alright, so this seam nests real nicely. This is the very center of my quilt here. And remember, we've got seams in the middle here, but they don't match. They're a couple inches away from each other. So we just have to pin in the center of it, make sure we're doing well. Alright, well I'm going to continue pinning going down the row. You just want to keep matching up the center of your block and the ends of your block. And make sure you pin real neatly there, and then kind of split the difference and go about halfway in between each of the pins to make sure you have even pinning across the entire row. Then I'm going to come back and we're going to sew these bad boys together. So what I've done here is I put the majority of the row in my lap, and that will help keep it from dragging on the floor as I am sewing and getting pins where they shouldn't be. So now I can just go ahead and start sewing. And my goal is to try to transfer as much of the weight of the quilt onto the table as I can as I'm working. And again, I've got my hand back here. I'm not pulling it through, I'm just guiding as I sew. Help keep it nice and straight, because as you get more and more quilt top together, it sometimes wants to go this way, and so we want to keep it going nice and straight as we're sewing everything together. So now you should have 2 rows of 4 sewn together, and we're ready to press those and then sew our 2 halves together to finish our quilt top. Now this is a pretty simple pattern. It's 4 blocks wide by 4 blocks tall. You may have a lot more blocks than that in a quilt that you do next. So just make sure if you sew it into sets of 2, and then sew your 2s together into 4s, and then keep adding until you have enough to make your entire row. It makes it go a lot faster, a lot easier. And then when you start sewing your rows together, if you sew 1 and 2 together, and 3 and 4, and 5 and 6, and so on, then you just have less seams and less seams as you go on. So I hope you have a little bit better idea on how to read that layout diagram. We're going to finish up here and get this top ready to be quilted. So when you get to this point, it doesn't matter so much which direction you press it, because we're not going to be crossing over any seams anymore. So what I'm going to just do is make sure that I set my seam, and you would do that going all the way down your row. It would be easiest to work on an ironing board at this point, not one of these pressing mats. And in this case, I'm just going to press it underneath these blue butterflies, and you know, if you pressed it under the pink butterflies next, that wouldn't be the end of the world. I do like to keep it consistent, so I'll probably press them all underneath the blue butterflies. But same way we've been pressing it along, you start with your iron on the side you're pressing away from and guide it up, and that gives you a really nice flat seam with no pleats. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just keep going down. Again, this is a little bit easier when you're on an ironing board because you can get the majority of a quilt this size on it, so you don't have to fuss with moving it as much. But I'm going to press my iron completely on second row and then bring it up over that seam to get it nice and flat with no pleats. Go ahead and keep pressing, and then we're going to come back and pin one more time to get that center seam sewn together, and then our quilt top is complete. All right, so I've got my 2 halves pressed and ready to pin together. Again, this is the exact same process as the other ones, just we have bigger pieces that we're working with. I'm making sure when I lay this out that my pieces are in the same spot in each side. So if my pink butterfly is in the top, then my blue butterfly needs to be in the bottom. So once I have this together, again, this is easier to do on a large table or floor or bed. I'm going to flip these right sides together, and I'm going to start pinning from the corner in. Same process as before. You can go ahead and put a pin where those middle of those blocks come together, and then where the corner is. And then in the middle of those 2. Then we're going to find where our blocks are. So there's the end of our first block. Put my pin there, and then in the middle. All right, you guys know the drill by now on how to pin this. You've done it twice before. I'm going to go ahead and finish pinning, then we'll sew it together, and our top will be complete. So when you're sewing this part together, this is where you really want to get as much as you can in your lap and on top of your table, because this is where it starts to get a little bit heavy with all the fabric that is in this quilt, and it can kind of pull it in a direction you don't want to go. So I'm using my hand to guide in the back. And then as I readjust my needle each time, I'm kind of lifting and putting more of the quilt onto the table. All right, so I've sewed it all. We have one final seam to press down the center, and then we can see how this baby looks. So this set, our quilt top is all done. It's looking super cute. I'm very excited to see this quilted. In our next video, we're gonna go over how to layer and base the quilt to make a quilt sandwich. So it's not something you eat, it is fabric as the bread and batting as the meat. So we'll go over what that means and how to do it and talk about some batting choices. And we're gonna move to my shop at Quilt Addicts Anonymous in Rock Island, Illinois to do that because we got a little bit more space than what's available in my home sewing studio. And that's good for when you are layering and basting a quilt. So you get to see this all together. I would love to see how your quilts are coming together. Just tag me on Instagram at Quilt Addicts Anonymous and use the hashtag beginner quilting QAA, and we will see everything that you have going on. I would love to see how this is going. Well, I hope you're enjoying this tutorial series. I hope you're very proud of yourself. You have your first quilt top done. We can see the finish line. So all we have left is we're gonna make our quilt sandwich. I'm gonna show you how to quilt it on your home sewing machine. And then we're gonna talk about binding, which is the part that goes around the edges. And then we're gonna talk about care for it and how to label it so that generations from now, they know that this was your quilt that you made lovingly with your hands. So we're almost there. We are almost done with this quilt. You should be really excited. Go put your feet up and then watch the next video on how to get it prepped for quilting. Thanks again to QT Fabrics for sponsoring this video and for making the beautiful fabrics that we have been working with as we have been making this quilt. And remember that the pattern for this quilt is available at shop.quiltaddictsanonymous.com. We're going to have a link straight to it in the description for this video, or you could head on over to that website and search for Split 9 Patch. You can download it for free, and we're able to do that because of our sponsors over at QT Fabrics. And then you're going to get a discount on everything that you need to make this quilt. So if you need to get a bunch of supplies, you can watch our supply video and see what you need and what it's for. And everything that's included in that video is that you can get on sale when you use that special coupon code that you'll get after you download your pattern. Thanks so much for following along. Thanks again to QT Fabrics for being our sponsors. And until next time, happy quilting.